Okay.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Africa America Institute's 10th Annual State of Education Conference. My name is Felicia Penting, and I'm the President and CEO of AAI. Over the years, we've explored questions of diaspora identity, the climate crisis and repair, and the future of African higher education through conversations with scholars, journalists, authors, practitioners, and policymakers. This year, in partnership with Howard University and Boston University, we follow a new path, the Gold Road. Our State of Education series is rooted in a simple truth, that the self-determination of Africa and the diaspora are inextricably linked. A rigorous generative understanding of Africa's history illuminates that connection. By following the Gold Road, we traced how West Africa has shaped the modern world, and we reclaim history as a compass that helps us understand who we are, where we come from, and how we navigate an ever-changing world. We began this conference a decade ago, drawing inspiration and evidence from our archives. And while the Gold Road offers special insight for educators, this gathering is open to all. Welcome, and thank you for walking this road with us.
My name is Vanessa Oyugi, and along with Brenda Randolph, I serve as the co-director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University. This year's State of Education Conference draws inspiration from the Gold Road website, a project initiated by our center in 2018. In 2020, the Boston University African Studies Center joined us as a partner in this project. A term coined by my colleague Brenda Randolph, the Gold Road reframes global medieval history by placing Africa at the center of the world economy, highlighting the role of gold and West Africa's contributions to art, architecture, learning, and governance. The Gold Road concept invites us to examine medieval West Africa through a broad lens, one that expands the familiar historical narrative of salt for gold trade to include other vital resources. And it also highlights significant historical players in addition to the one that we typically talk about, Mansa Musa. The Gold Road offers a much-needed corrective to humanities curricula that traditionally spotlight the Silk Road while overlooking Africa's pivotal role in the same global processes and time periods. It challenges us to rethink what we teach, how we teach, and whose stories we elevate.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's State of Education on Africa conference. My name is Elsa Villet, and I lead the Boston University African Studies Center Education Outreach Program. We are one of the collaborating institutions on this important series hosted by the Africa America Institute. The Boston University African Studies Center has for decades promoted knowledge about Africa in K-12 schools and in higher education across the US with the motto, Education about Africa for Everyone. We develop curricula, support educators with professional development, and many more resources that contribute to the expansion of knowledge about Africa. Our mission directly supports the goals of the Africa America Institute's State of Education Conference, with this year's theme, Following the Gold Road. This theme is crucial in a larger project of building knowledge about the pre-colonial history of powerful African societies, their central role in world history, and their astounding legacies. Knowledge that has been historically distorted in educational spaces or omitted altogether. We know that we are living in a time where politically driven policies are restricting this history. So, we are pleased to go the other direction and offer Following the Gold Road series to you today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Sarah Guerin at the University of Pennsylvania, and I am going to get started this afternoon's session. First, I would like to thank everyone involved in organizing and facilitating today's event and the whole lecture series on following the gold route. Felicia Appentang, who you just heard from, President and CEO of the Africa America Institute, Vanessa Oyugi and Brenda Randolph from Howard University Center for African Studies Outreach Program. And it's a delight to be working with both Brenda and Vanessa again. To Elsa VA of Boston University's African Studies Center. And I'm also grateful behind the scenes for Hyde Ripley for their support in setting up today's webinar. And last but not least, I would like to thank Yinka Adegoke, who has so kindly stepped up this afternoon to interrogate a medieval art historian on economic history. So in the last session, Professor Gomez spoke very broadly about the social and political complexion of West Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, across the period of about 250 years, of about 500 years, from 1100 to 1500, charting the formation of three important empires that's Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, as well as discuss the more important interactions of these polities with the broader world at that time. What I want to do for you today, speaking from my area of expertise as a medieval art historian, particularly interested in interregional trade, economics, and exchange, is to survey the vast array of commodities that moved across the Sahara in the same period from 1000 to 1500. And so doing, I want to underscore that gold was an important good that was traded, but it was not alone. It was not alone among the surplus goods that were traded out of West Africa to the rest of the world. And that B, the range of raw materials and products that were brought into West Africa and purchased with that gold was wide-ranging and sophisticated, and shows that shows sophisticated tastes and desires of the West African communities at this time. And so it was not just salt, as is so frequently misrepresented in our contemporary media, but rather West Africans enjoyed and used the very best of the medieval world had to offer at this time. And it similarly contributed to these luxuries. All right, so I'll share my screen. Here we are. So towards the beginning of the medieval French romance, the Roman de la Rose, Guillaume de Loris described a marvelous garden of love where apple trees grow pomegranates, nut trees grow nutmegs, and where almond, fig, and date trees flourish within cloistered walls. These fruits of the Orient were joined by every imaginable spice, good for cleansing the palate after a meal: cloves, licorice, zedawari, anise, cinnamon, and an exotic news spice called grains of paradise, graines de paradis nouvelles. Written in the third decade of the 13th century, Guillaume's poem marks one of the first instances this peppery seed related to the ginger plant is recorded in Western Europe. Also known as Melegueta pepper, Aphromomen melegueta remained an extremely popular spice at French and Burgundian courts for approximately 2 centuries. And unlike locally available licorice or anise or cinnamon and zedawari, also known as white turmeric, which was imported from the Indian subcontinent, or cloves and nutmeg from the spiced islands of Indonesia, grains of paradise are native to the rainforests of West Africa alone, and so came to Northern Europe by completely different routes. This long distance relay network, which linked Guillaume de Loris's France and Paris to the coastal rainforests of West Africa via trans-Saharan trade, brought many goods to Western Europe, besides the grains of paradise with which we began. Namely, and perhaps most consequentially, gold from the alluvial deposits in modern Senegal and Mali, the grains of paradise, and gold from, you see them indicated here in yellow. Elephant tusks, which were carved into exquisite religious objects at this time. There's also ebony wood from the forests, exotic animal skins, which have been recently testified by excavations at Djibouti in Western Senegal, as well as the unglamorous but absolutely essential chemical fixative of alum, which was essential to the European textile industry, whose productivity at this moment was fast accelerating. Many myths have circulated about what Arabic and Amazigh traders brought to West Africa in exchange for these remarkable riches. And you are all familiar with the tale told by Herodotus of the so-called silent trade, where gold is wordlessly exchanged for salt via a naive barter system. The Mamluk historian al-Umari, writing in Cairo in the mid-14th century, perpetuated a similar oversimplification, noting that caravans set off from Sijil Massa, the hugely important trade entrepot in today's southern Morocco, southwards across the Sahara with valueless articles like salt, copper, and cowries, and returned with bullion as their camel's burden. However, the goods sent south across the Sahara were emphatically not valueless to the West African civilizations which desired them, whose particular regimes of value were dependent on local environments and culturally construed hierarchies. There are no universal commodity values. Each community, the world over, adjudicates for themselves what a good is worth to them. Indeed, Arjuna Padurai has articulated the finely attuned relationship of exchange as one of mutual sacrifice of both parties. And he writes, one's desire for an object is fulfilled by the sacrifice of some other object, which is the focus of the desire of another. Such exchange of sacrifices is what economic life is all about. So, in my time with you today, I want to look carefully at one invaluable textual source that gives us a clear sense of the mechanics of interregional exchange in the 13th century, and that is the network of the Al-Makari brothers. After this, I want to explore, mostly via archaeological evidence, some of the commodities that were prized by West African communities, prized that is beyond the oft-mentioned salt. And although I do want to take care to underscore that, in fact, salt alone among all of these commodities, it is the only one that is biologically necessary. And so it's perhaps the most logical and fundamental of the trade commodities we mention here. Without salt, mammals, including humans, die. Punkt. But aside from salt, many other commodities were prized and imported. And I want to look together with you at three. Glass beads, which are among the most ancient of the trade goods, ceramics, and I will end with a deeper dive into copper alloys. So part one, trans-Saharan trade and its world of goods. One of the most detailed discussions of the mechanics of caravan trade across the Sahara is that of Ibn al-Khatib, writing in Granada, that's southern Iberia, in the mid-14th century. Abi Abd Ali Muhammad al-Makari of Tlemcen in modern Algeria had visited Granada in May of 1356, and Ibn al-Khatib recorded his comments on his family's trading networks, established on either side of the Sahara in the mid-13th century. And so the text reads that al-Makari's ancestors, according to what is stated in their biographies, became famous in trade. They established the desert route by digging wells and seeing to the security of merchants. The sons of Yaha were 5. They made a partnership by which all had equal shares in what they possessed or might possess. Abu Bakr and Muhammad were in Tlemcen. Abd al-Rahman, who was their elder brother, was in Sijamasa. Abd al-Wahid and Ali, who were the 2 younger brothers, were in Iwatalan or Walata. They, all of the brothers, acquired properties and houses in the given regions, married wives, and begat children by concubines. The Tilminsani, would send to the Sawari, those in the Sahara, that is Walata, the goods which the latter would indicate to him. And the Sahrawi would send to him skins, nuts, ivory, and gold. The Sijilmasi were like the tongues of a balance, indicating to them the extent of rise or fall of the markets and writing to them about the affairs of merchants and countries. And so their wealth expanded and their status grew. Walata is a small oasis town, now in the deserts of southeast Mauritania, that gained importance in trans-Saharan trade just as the al-Makari family was consolidating their own network in the mid-13th century. Al-Umari described Walata as the farthest point of inhabited country after the grueling 1,500-kilometer trek across the desert from Sijilmasa. Ibn al-Khatib and the text of al-Umari, cited earlier, thus enumerate the standard commodities associated with medieval trans-Saharan trade. Gold, elephant ivory, skins, and joies, or nuts, but which I translate more precisely as grains of paradise. Other historical sources mention more goods, including indigo and ebony, and there were also, sadly, enslaved individuals included in these exchanges. But unfortunately, these lives are notoriously difficult to follow through the archaeological record. Although Al-Umari considered them valueless articles, the salt, copper, and cowries imported into sub-Saharan Africa were essential to the health, spiritual, physical, as well as economic of sub-Saharan communities. The importance of salt, especially in a hot climate, is incontrovertible, and there are few natural sources in West Africa. In fact, the paramount importance of this mineral might have provided the initial impetus for interregional exchange, including that went across the Sahara in the ancient world. The mines at Tagaza, Mali, the bed of an ancient salt lake, was a key source of both rock salt for the diet, as well as the mineral fixative of alum, which I've already mentioned was increasingly important for the Northern European textile industry. Tagaza is also, not coincidentally, almost exactly the midpoint on the Sigil-Massa-Walata route. Copper, sometimes called red gold, came from mines not only within the Sahara itself, so Akujit, Mauritania, or Tessilit, Mali, but also from around the Mediterranean basin and, as we will see in closing, far beyond. Used in West Africa primarily for artistic and ritual purposes, um, uh, um, local communities vastly preferred the locally available iron for both weapons and tools. So copper was a ritual material that was brought in. Copper and its alloys have recently been shown by Laurence Garenne-Marot to have been valued for its spiritual malleability. In a number of sub-Saharan cultures, copper responds particularly well to secret technologies of the blacksmiths. Cowrie shells, a mollusk most prevalent in the Indian Ocean, were used as currency in many parts of the Islamic world, including West Africa. Their passage to North Africa via the Red Sea and Egypt, and thence to West Africa by trans-Saharan caravan, truly bespeaks West Africa's involvement in the world system. And I just want to quickly call attention here to Anna Hauer and Annalisa Christie's 2019 article, which definitively demonstrated that the cowries from the Ma'aden Ijafen find, on which I'll speak more later, definitively came from the species found in the Indian Ocean. And I've linked to this in the show notes. The trade of gold for cowries, therefore, I would encourage us to consider as an exchange of monetary instruments between distinct regimes of value. Rather than Al-Umari's vision of an exploitative system in which mere trinkets are exchanged for pure bullion. And then to the salt, copper, and cowries traveling across the Sahara that we've just mentioned, we can add cloth, both luxurious silks and quotidian woolen wares alike. And today I will address glass beads, porcelain, and return to copper. So let's start with glass. The Garamantes were an advanced civilization that arose in the midst of the Sahara in modern Libya in a period in the ancient world, in a period of relatively greater rainfall, facilitating life in the midst of the desert. And it was an important southern trading partner of the Roman Empire. The main city of the Garamantes was Garama, after which they're named, and they are mentioned also by Herodotus as important pastoralists as well as enslavers of neighboring populations. And it's thought by archaeologists that it's enslaved laborers who are responsible for the extensive system of fogueras, which allowed irrigation in the barren landscape by tapping into groundwater for crops. And it's important to note that such technology and indeed the infrastructure laid by the Garamantes persisted across the centuries and permitted oases to flourish across the Sahara that thus supported trans-Saharan trade. So it's this kind of initial infrastructure that's laid down in the ancient period that continues to support trans-Saharan trade through the Middle Ages. However, around Garama, the groundwater was overtapped at this time and seems to have dried out or sometime in the 4th century. And this, with climate change, seems to have led to the demise of the civilization. Excavations at Garama were undertaken for decades under David Mattingly, and the results have been published in massive scholarly volumes through the early 2000s. What this research has revealed was a Saharan civilization closely integrated with both West Africa and the broader Roman world. One of the most telling categories of finds points to a secondary glass industry. That is the importation of glass, either as finished objects or the raw material or cullet, that is then melted down and reshaped on site. The main object type that was formed at Garama are glass beads, and evidence of crucibles for the melting of glass and wasters, or that's production offcuts, were excavated on site. And so for me, this fact is extremely interesting when compared with other contemporaneous sites that have been excavated in West Africa. And most telling are the extensive beads found at the graves of Kisi in modern Burkina Faso, excavated and analyzed by Sonia Magnavita. These are of both glass and semi-precious stones, namely alabaster and carnelian. And Magnavita further analyzed the chemical composition of the glass beads from Kisi and found that their signatures point to primary glass production of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's Kisi on the map, just south of the Niger River. There we are. And then there are the sites of the primary glass production, which was then found among the beads at Kisi. So Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and the Middle East. In other words, the major glass producing regions of the Roman world are found or witnessed here at Kisi. And whether or not the glass beads here had passed through Garama to find their way to the Niger River Bend is uncertain, but it is extremely likely. In other words, that the beads themselves were formed at Garama before moving farther south. The beautiful carnelian beads, however, tell a complementary and interesting story. And those found at Kisi can be compared in size, shape, and chemical composition to a small but significant corpus of carnelian beads found elsewhere in West Africa. So I'm showing you here those from Derby Takashe in northern Nigeria, and at the bottom of the screen, beads from a megalithic site in Senegal. New chemical analysis has proven that the carnelian used in all of these finds comes not from the Indian subcontinent as had been previously supposed, but rather from carnelian deposits in the Sahara itself, the Adrar de Efforgas, the geological region in which Tedmeka, an important site that we'll look at shortly, is also located. Not only are such beads found across West Africa, thousands of kilometers from their source, but carnelian offcuts of the same chemical signature are similarly found at Garama from the first centuries of the Common Era, signaling that the Garamantes, and this is important, were sourcing raw material from both the Mediterranean world and the Middle East, and from much closer to home from the Sahara. And from both sites, that raw material is formed into objects that are used for interregional exchange. And I would underscore that the outstanding quality of such items is testified to by a near complete carnelian necklace that was excavated and is now obviously restrung from Garama itself, which gives you a sense of the tastes. The beads from Kisi have one more story to tell. Well, the majority of the glass bears chemical signatures that point to the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Two of these beads have a very rare high lime, high alumina chemical composition. Now, the reason I'm getting into this detail is because the only primary production site of glass with this recipe is remarkably the old Yoruba site of Ile-Ife in modern Nigeria. Tunde Babalola has published extensively on the finds at Ile-Ife, and he has dated these to the 13th and 14th centuries. His findings conclude very convincingly that primary glass production developed endogenously, locally at Ile-Ife, meaning that the skilled technicians of the Okolun Grove, already famed for their terracotta and copper alloy sculptures, also invented a unique glass formula, relying on locally available materials to temper melted silica. That high lime, high aluminum glass was identified at Kisi from the first centuries of the Common Era, pushes back this key discovery by about a millennium, and then demonstrates that in terms of technologically advanced materials circulating in West Africa, and not just imported ones, we still have much to learn. It's a moving frontier of knowledge. So ceramics, or porcelain in particular. Sam Nixon's excavations at the site of Tedmeka in northern Mali have revealed a number of astonishing finds, and many of these were the focal points of the exhibition Caravans of Gold, Fragments in Time, curated by Kathleen Bickford-Berzock in 2019 to 2021. Perhaps the most enigmatic and unexpected is a 1.3 centimeter wide piece of porcelain from Jiangxi province in Sung Dynasty, China. The white paste porcelain, typical of that site, bears a bluish green glaze, which gives this porcelain Qingbei ware its mean, because Qingbei means greenish white. Like the piece of silk also found at Tedmeka, the very existence of this fragment of Qingbei ware in the Sahara from a 10th to 12th century context powerfully demonstrates the Western Sahel's connection to trade and circulation over extremely long distances. Although we cannot be sure what type of object the small sherd came from, the gorgeous array of extant Qingbei ware of exceptional quality certainly stirs the imagination as to the material culture of Tedmeka. But what is certain is that Tedmeka was integrated into the tightly knit Afro-Eurasian trade networks which crisscrossed these three continents in this period. It is worth noting that this porcelain likely moved through the monsoon-driven trading systems of the Indian Ocean, thence up the Red Sea and the Nile, before moving westwards across North Africa by either land or sea, where it was then included in a caravan that headed southbound again across the Sahara. Research on alternative routes, that is east-west routes across the African savannas linking the Nile or the mercantile-oriented Swahili coast with Central and West Africa, is still in its nascent stages, though it may eventually prove a more direct itinerary cross-country. However, this fragment did arrive in Tedmeka, it's worth noting that its 10th to 12th century context at Tedmeka predates European access to and appreciation of Qingbei ware by several centuries. as the earliest known piece of Chinese porcelain in Western hands is the Fonthill vase. Its now lost gilt silver mount, testified in this 18th century drawing, suggests that it was first brought to Hungary by a Chinese Nestorian embassy on its way to Rome in 1338. But I cannot emphasize more that the fragment of Qingbei from Tadmeka predates this example by 300 to 400 years, demonstrate a sort of precocious tastes within the community at Tedmecca. So copper alloys. A cluster of 8 burial mounds at Derby Takashe in the savannas of northern Nigeria illustrates the reach of Mali's trading network in the 14th century. 3 of the tombs at Derby Takashe were high status, replete with goods closely associated with trans-Saharan trade. It includes metalwork from the Central Islamic lands or Middle East, glass beads from an impressive number of far-ranging locales, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, as we've already seen, copper alloy bracelets and anklets, and a number of pieces of solid gold jewelry, likely but not certainly forged in Senegal. Large ivory bangles were found in all 3 of the high status graves, fashioned from the tusks of savanna elephants roaming nearby, showing a local appreciation of this export commodity. And the tumuli of Derby Takashe thereby picture for us a community in direct contact with those elephant populations. So the juxtaposition of local ivory with carnelian, foreign glass, brass, and cowries indicates the high status of ivory and gold and a sense of these commodities' values. In addition to ivory, a wide range of copper alloy objects were found in the Derby Takashe tombs. Finished imported goods, anklets, and bracelets cast locally, and the raw material itself in the form of ingots, that is, long, slim rods appropriate for trade. 3 brass ingots were found with the male individual from tomb 5. In form, they are surprisingly close to those found in an abandoned shipment of around 2,085 brass bars, located by Theodore Monod in 1964 at Ma'aden, Ijafin. Monod had the chance to photograph and document this abandoned site, which he proposed was an abandoned caravan, and that has been dated through carbon-14 dating of some of the rope material, the organic material, to between 1000 and 1280. But it's important to note that this site was not properly excavated, and nor has it been relocated with significant effort having been put in recent years. Monod did retrieve 25 of those brass rods, and a recent analysis of their lead isotopes reveals, so isotopes allowing us to suggest or propose where the mines were originally, revealed that the copper ore was not likely excavated from any of the suspected North African sources. Instead, the closest match is a seam of copper ore stretching across modern Belgium and the German Harz region. Although these are preliminary findings, it seems that the brass ingots abandoned at Ma'aden Ijafin, though they never reached their final destination, had already come an enormous distance. An initial report on the isotopic analysis of the copper alloys from Derby Takashe states that the ingots found in Tumulus 5 similarly share isotopic ratios with a number of Western European ore deposits, also linking the burials to the Nigerian savannas to the mining centers of Northern Europe. And furthermore, and I think this is fascinating, while there is great diversity of isotopic ratios among the whole cache of copper alloy objects, the man who is buried with the ingots has the impressive anklets the impressive anklets that he wore into the grave are actually of the identical isotopic signature, which tells us that those objects were made from his own cache of material. They're cast from the raw material that he seems to own. And so, for this individual, for whom the brass trade, I would argue, was clearly important and whose identity it must have defined and shaped, had these objects fashioned for him from the materials of prestige trade to accompany him into the afterlife. The local and the foreign, the elephant ivory around his wrists and the European copper around his ankles both expressed his status and identity within his community. The technique of lost wax casting that's used for such items as the brass anklets from Derby Tekeshe appears to have been an independent indigenous development among the kingdoms of the Niger River Delta in modern Nigeria. Arguments about the origins of the technology played out around the remarkable finds of Igbo Ukwu near the mouth of the Niger River, including some 685 objects in copper and bronze, in addition to thousands of glass beads, terracotta sculptures, cowrie shells, and other regalia, which have been dated to between the 8th and the early 11th centuries. Not only do these artifacts stand witness to highly sophisticated artistic traditions, the analysis of the Igbo Ukwu bronzes reveals two significant sources for the copper ore. First, perhaps found in the earliest of these pieces, was identified with relatively local ore deposits in modern-day Nigeria along the Benue Rift. A second source, observed perhaps in slightly later bronzes, is from the North African copper deposits in Tunisia and Algeria, and thus products of trans-Saharan trade. At Igbo Ukwu, therefore, lost wax casting was first practiced based on regionally available indigenous resources. The subsequent success of this art form in further generations and the increased desire for its products evidently surpassed locally available resources, encouraging long-distance interregional trade. And the impetus for these networks thus came from an endogenous development at Igbo Ukwu, I would argue. Thurston Shaw, who excavated the sites of Igbo Ukwu, suggested that this long-distance trade was largely balanced by leveraging locally available elephant tusks to obtain desired goods. And it's worth noting, in fact, that 2 tusks have also been excavated from this site. In the 13th and 14th centuries, so some centuries later than Igbo Ukwu, the Yoruba kingdom of Ife was flourishing in the forest zone of the Niger River Delta. Ife is known today for its, so here it is on the map, and it's known today for an astonishing group of naturalistic lost wax cast copper alloy heads that were unearthed in the palace compound of the Oni or ruler of Ife in 1938. This burial was a secondary one. So instead of a dating based on archaeological context, as we've been dealing with for the majority of objects, the Ife bronzes have been dated via thermoluminescence. And I can answer questions in regards to that in the question period. But rather than the compelling heads found in the palace compound, I want to draw our attention to the seated figure that's related stylistically to the Ife bronzes, but which was found in Tara, a small Nupe trading village about 200 kilometers due north of Ife, along the banks of the Niger River. And this object offers what I think of as the perfect illustration of trade, exchange, and material desire. It's been dated to 1325 plus or minus 60 years by thermoluminescence. And the Tata figure is thus contemporary with the burials at Derby Takushe, the flourishing of the Empire of Mali that you heard about last time, and not insignificantly with the height of the use of African ivory in Western Europe. So seated on the ground with one leg bent and the other foot tucked underneath his seat, the 53.7 centimeter high sculpture displays remarkable attention to naturalistic details of the figure's anatomy and physiognomy. Although unanimously attributed to the workshops of Ife due to stylistic and technical similarities, the seated figure was found rather in a so-called sacred hut at Tata, and it was then moved in 1979 to the National Museum of Lagos. Isotopic analysis of this object, which is cast from nearly pure copper, indicates that the ore came neither from local Nigerian sources, nor from a North African one, nor from the Harz region that constituted the ingots at Me'aden Ijafin or Derby Takashe. Instead, the copper ore seems to come from the Massif Central, a mineral-rich outcropping of the Earth's crust in southern France. The copper from which the Tata figure was cast thus comes from the very territories that so desired savanna elephant ivory at exactly the same moment. Elephant tusks that were in turn carved into figures for Christian worship. For example, the Abbey of Frigolet, 70 kilometers or about 2 days' journey from the southern limits of the Massif Central, had an ivory virgin and child just at this time. These two communities, therefore, Frigolet and Tara, can therefore be posited, I would say, as being in a mutually dependent chiastic relationship, each providing for the other raw materials for the production of ritually important figural sculpture. They can be seen materially and artistically as equal partners in an exceptionally long distance intercontinental trade network, and they were therefore an exchange of sacrifices. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Can you hear me? Okay, good, good, good. No, thank you for that. That was that was just excellent. There's so much to get into there, so much to get into. We are a little bit over time, so I'm just gonna try and just, get through to a couple of questions and then bring in questions from the audience. I guess I mean, so many things were fascinating. I mean, I guess the overarching takeaway for me was how important trade has been to the peoples of these regions for so long. The sort of interregional trade, the and importantly, the sort of the global trade, those connections you make, those items that the Chinese bits of pottery and silk from like the 13th, 14th century, pre-European, So because I deal with today as a journalist, and some of the biggest stories today about Africa are really just about trade and how Africans need to trade with each other because
Mhm.
trade on the continent with intra-African trade is so
Yeah.
low compared to Europe or
Yeah.
Asia or anywhere else. And, the sort of the big lessons that you might think we should learn from history. It's all the big overarching lessons, not so much, intricate policy, but just sort of like how this happened, 5, 6, 700 years ago, and
Yeah.
how we could be doing more of that now.
Yeah, thank you, Yinka. I think those are really great questions to be asking of this really nitty-gritty material
Yeah,
that I
yeah, it's
just
just
presented you.
overarching. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you bring up the importance of inter regional intra
Yeah.
trade, right? Instead of always thinking of
Selling.
Africa
Yeah.
to the rest of the world, which from the period just after that, the one that I was looking at predominantly with European colonial interventions within West Africa, that really became the model of a kind of an extractive colonialism, taking the extraordinary resources of Africa and bringing that wealth elsewhere, right? Whether that is the mineral wealth or if it's
Yes.
the wealth of human labor that was violently removed.
Yes. Yes.
So I think kind of one thing for me that's really important is examining a model, a historical model, where that European or external a relationship that kind of an extractive colonial relationship was not the predominant mode of economic life,
It
right?
felt
That
more
these are
two-way, right? It felt more
yeah,
like, yes.
definitely more two-way and more local leaders and emperors controlling the resources and negotiating fair contracts with trading partners, right? To get the goods that are needed by their communities,
Mm.
and that these are both the essential ones for clothing, for the importance of salt, of course, as biologically necessary, as I kind of tried to make that point, but for luxuries too, for
Yes.
participating in kind of a global courtly culture, that the same wares are on the table in Tedmecca as they are in
Europe.
Rome
Yeah. Yeah.
or Baghdad, right? That there's a kind of a continual desire to participate in this global culture, if
Mm.
we can use global for this time period. I
Yes,
hope
yes,
everyone
yes,
hears
yes.
the scare
Yes.
scare quotes around my use of that term.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fantastic point. I mean, what do you think? I mean, just because we have the nature of the audience that we have today, some of them are obviously students or young people. What do you think young Africans on the continent
Mm.
or young Americans here, should learn from this history? What should they? What's a sort of a core, lesson
Yeah.
to learn from that
Well,
period?
one of one of the lessons I think, a lesson I think one of the takeaways, maybe is a better way of saying it, is that there are other models of Africa's participation in history than the one that's predominantly taught, especially in North American schools,
Yes,
right? I think that
yes.
that is, for me, a very different narrative that existed before European involvement in the African continent in the 15th century. That's a rich and complex history that has been um, at best,
Latin?
yeah, at best neglected, at worst suppressed, right?
Yes.
And that excavating that history, literally and figuratively, gives a different model for thinking about the future. And I mentioned in our little chat beforehand that I really love this quote by Mark Derry, who is the writer and critic who coined the term of Afrofuturism.
Mm.
And and I love this, and just allow me to read it. He says, the notion of Afrofuturism gives rise to a troubling antinomy. Can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history image possible futures? And
Mm,
so, really, kind of like linking this idea of imagining a better future, being
right.
grounded in understanding different models from the past, I think is a really and is a really exciting way of approaching this history, the deep past, which can be, you know, dealing with a lot of fragments, a lot of technical information. But I have to say, and for everyone who's listening to me right now, I think that that West African history and archaeology is one of the fields, the historical fields, where you can make the most significant discoveries now.
Yeah.
Every time I search for something again, there is something new that has come out that is paradigm shifting. That's not the case of any
Yeah.
other archaeological
I
field.
noted
It
you
is,
said moving frontier of knowledge.
yeah,
That's what you said.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Exactly that.
yeah, yeah. And so it's exciting, and there's so much new information coming to the
Yeah.
fore, and real work to be done.
I'm going to go over to the questions. We have a couple of people who, loved your presentation, and we have one here from Miss Waltz who asked, who says, "I am interested in developing a trade activity so students can easily see what goods were traded and and where they came from. It's good geography practice, as the teacher said.
Yeah.
I'm picturing a card game with a map board. Is there something
Uh-huh.
like that already out there?"
Wow, I'm so glad you asked. First of all, I would direct you towards the fantastic resource that Vanessa and colleagues at Howard have constructed of the Gold Route website. And in recent conversations with Brenda, I know she also is thinking of developing a board game, exactly as you think, sort of, Gold Root Monopoly or something similar to that. So keep your eye on that
Fantastic.
space. I think it's a great idea. I think it would be fun.
Yeah, it really is, and it does make it more accessible to younger audiences, and then and those who really take to it go deeper, and
Yeah.
they'll be here in a few years giving a presentation like yours.
Yeah.
Um, Bram says, this presentation was amazing. Thank you. You really showed how much archaeology has transformed our understanding of the trans-Saharan trade and the extent of the trade connections. I thought that too. Is there a good resource you would recommend for teaching these issues? Another teacher, it sounds like.
Um, I guess it would depend at what age. Again, the Gold Roots website is something that is being aimed a little bit more at K to 12. But I think that a couple of essays here, I'm just going to grab a book. Is that allowed? No one said that I couldn't do this. Um,
We're making the rules up. Don't worry,
we're
folks.
making the rules up. Um, uh,
Oh,
I
that's
teach this book, which is called The Golden Rhinoceros: Histories of the African Middle Ages, written by François Xavier Fauvel. And it's nice because they're little, quite lively written vignettes about major archaeological finds across all of Africa. So it doesn't just concentrate on West Africa as I do, but François Xavier looks really broadly across the whole continent in the so-called Middle Ages. And these are short readings, which would be very accessible, I would say, for high school students especially. And this is what I would suggest for that age range. But for the younger kids, I would certainly do the activities on the Gold Route website.
yeah.
And there's a lot of resources too that we made for the Caravans of Gold. Um, exhibition that are still available. And those are available in English, French, and Arabic as well.
Fantastic. Let me ask you one question that I was thinking as you were speaking. You did this fantastic explanation of how the Gold Road and all the various trade connections work. But I was wondering about the context that you started with about the three empires that we've talked about,
Mhm.
in the last presentation.
Mhm.
For this one, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai.
Mali, it's okay.
So what role do those empires have in the way this trade route kind of
Hmm.
works, or the various trade
Hmm.
routes, not just one?
Hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, you're totally right. It's, it's hard to say because we don't necessarily have we don't have all the bureaucratic
Yeah.
paperwork
Mhm.
for these empires that allow us to understand kind of the inner functionings of bureaucracy in the same way that we do for other states at this point in time. But
Even
what
for Mali with Timbuktu and all that.
Yeah, no, the texts that we have from Timbuktu are
Islamic.
mostly religious
Yeah.
in nature, right? Because it's a center of
Okay.
Islamic learning,
Yeah.
and they're fantastic. I think that's another treasure trove of material that really needs to be worked on by serious scholars. So, if anyone out there is a young scholar, you want a project. But what we do know from historical sources that give us some sense of how the government functions is the Mansa or the emperors kind of controlling the highest level of trade. We hear stuff like they hold back really enormous pieces of gold, and you get a sense of not flooding the market, of retaining some of those prestige goods for their own self-fashioning, for the opulence of their court, but also of being sort of judicious with how these resources are managed, and so not letting too much go, of letting kind of an appropriate trickle out,
Right. Right.
so to encourage trade and to ensure trade. The sources tell us too about interesting. Vis-a-vis the Islamification of West Africa,
Hmm.
that there was a concern that if the regions where there were gold fields became Islam, that the local gods would be upset, and so the gold would dry up. So they purposefully did not convert these regions. So there's a sense, but all of this is very distorted through several different
Yeah.
layers of translation, we can say. Yeah.
One last question from Elaine, who asks, would it be possible to get copies of the primary sources used in
Uh,
this presentation?
Oh, Elaine, I'm so glad you asked. I did assemble kind of a list of the sources that I've consulted to share on the website afterwards. So mostly, I've privileged those that are not behind a paywall and that are freely accessible. But yeah, also, Elaine, if there's something in particular that you're interested in, please, and this goes for everyone who's listening to this, shoot me an email. I would be more than happy to help and to direct you towards resources that kind of support things that I mentioned in passing.
Okay. I think that's it. I think that was fantastic. I have learned so much today, and I'm really going to get into reading a bit more on this because you just opened all kinds of doors
Oh,
and
awesome.
to make connections to a lot of what we're seeing today. I just like to thank our hosts, the Africa America Institute, Howard Universities, Center for African Studies, Boston University as well, and obviously you're from UPenn, so thanks to them for letting us have you
Use the Wi-Fi.
use the Wi-Fi. Excellent. But yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, and I'm sure everyone learned a lot. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Inka, for your really kind interactions. Yeah.
Thank you.